Well, thanks to everyone who is in the room now, virtually, and hopefully to have much more kind of really also on-site discussion soon on what I would like to develop within this kind invitation for this exhibition, a housing manifesto, a growing housing manifesto. We could call it for intersectional solidarity, or actually, in fact, really as one of the many, many contributions, I would say that the worldwide housing crisis actually is really needing from all of us. I mean, I think it's needless to say that the housing crisis is, in fact, really at this moment back nearly in every city, at least in every growing city. It is even itself growing with the corona crisis. We see a lot of people affected by the current situation. But independent of the pandemic, housing has become a serious planning issue within so many cities, and it has become really a protest issue, as you can see here. And one of the starting points of the worldwide protests, and also, of course, the worldwide movement, is the claim that housing is a human right. And if we think of housing as a human right, we must actually look into the Article 25 of the Universal Declarations of Human Rights. And I think this is maybe a good moment to read this all together. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. Of course, we should one's right herself as well, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his or her control. Well, if we believe in that, which I do hope we all do in a way, that everybody has the right, of course, to adequate housing, we see that it's not fulfilled at all. And this makes people really get out on the street. This is one of the protests that I also co-organized in Vienna. It says the same sentence now in German: housing is a human right. It is a whole collection of people intersectionally working and questing and aiming at really getting closer to this right being actually realized. And this is even within a city of Vienna, which we'll come closer to in a moment. That is, of course, a city that is currently looked at from many places as a rather good example when it comes to the housing situation. If we give it one more just quick thought or reading of that the right to housing is also called the right to adequate housing, then there is and has been United Nations special rapporteurs such as Rachel Rolnick, for instance, who even specifies that it does actually mean the security of all forms of tenure and the protection against forced evictions. That is so important in a time that forced evictions is actually, the number of forced evictions is growing. It does mean access to basic services, healthcare, education, water. You can read all of that. It says transport, leisure, green spaces, health environment. That at once declares that housing, of course, is not only a room, is not only a tiny apartment. It does mean really the right to the city. It also means the right to use appropriate and adequate materials ensuring habitability, including adequate space and effective protection against natural threats to health and life. Now, this is a very contemporary notion, as we know that, for instance, with the pandemic, it has become the protection to be at home, while being at home, however, really also has become very precarious, especially due to the very tiny living conditions, such as we just saw with Jan walking into our minimum room. It also means the affordability of and the access to means of subsistence, including access to land, infrastructure, natural environment, resources, and sources of livelihood and work. Now, you may seem that this may seem very far away from the actual note of housing, but housing is at once related to land politics. We'll talk about this in a moment. And of course, to the question of is there accessibility and affordability of resources also to work and to actually be independent and self-esteemed, decisive. The right of participation in all stages and processes of decision-making related to housing. This is something that is very difficult at this moment for a lot of homeowners to experience, as within this housing crisis, already to have a house is for so many people the most important urgent need, and then to be able to kind of be decisive about it, to have a say in how we live, how one wants to live, in what sort of also a relationship with others. That is a second quest that we need to put to housing. And at the end, and this is really maybe the most important to say, it does mean the prioritization of the needs of the vulnerable and historically marginalized minorities. If everybody has a home, this is the moment that we should actually declare what the human rights to housing actually means. So I could actually now give you a couple of protest images, many of which I have been lucky or happy or even nervous to speak myself in front of people. And honestly, aside from my architectural and urbanist planning work, I've never, hardly ever, learned as much as within these protest movements, and especially from my now dear friend Regina Amer, who is standing and speaking next to me in this photograph. We have often spoken together in protests on housing. She has been and is a declared housing activist. She was homeless herself and has since then supported and been a loud voice within the struggle and battle, and also the voice who taught myself clearly that at least in German we have this awful saying that there may be people who are socially weak, which of course is something that Regina at once declared to be absolutely nonsense. And it's good to hear that so in such clear words. Her term is like, we are not socially weak, we may be financially weak. Socially weak is the system which allows people to lose their homes. It's the system that actually is socially weak and not caring for everyone within the notion of housing. Well, she was also a contributor of one of our research works that we did recently, commissioned by the city of Vienna and dealing specifically with the housing situation and crisis of women, especially women, because as there is a gender gap, we still have really financial problems with lower money that women earn, also with a more possibly crisis in their lifetimes. And this actually gave us a real insight into even also the problematic housing conditions in what I already said, so much celebrated Vienna, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So if we follow Regina Amer, but also Peter Marcuse and lots of thinkers, then he pointed out so clearly homelessness exists not because the system is failing to work as it should, but because the system is working as it must. It's systematic to have a housing crisis, and that's something we must be really aware of. And also that's why I do think that it needs a lot of combined forces and exercises, such as to write this housing manifesto, but many more to actually fight against it. But of course, there's other allies, and many of them I have collected within this exhibition, is Leilani Faha, who so clearly got it to the point. Housing is a human right, not a financial product, in the very much recommended film Push, for instance. And to bring that to a point, I would like to show you a couple of now recent photographs from Vienna. This is a photograph of a construction site in the very city center of Vienna. And since it's a bit small, I will read what the advertising of this with this beautiful woman that is portrayed here says. It says, "You don't have to live in these apartments to love Vienna. Owning them will do." And after I've seen this the first time, and I still thank Renate Cordon for borrowing me this photograph, so to say, I couldn't have found a better image to show us what concrete gold means, what the financialization of housing, of space and urban space means. It is about owning urban space and not living in there. So the real detachment between the commodity, the financial product, and the need to actually have housing. And this, you could say, this advertising isn't necessarily only in the city centers, but in all the good places. And currently, I have to say that I'm even experiencing myself being called by investors, literally saying, "We buy everything. Don't you have an apartment anywhere in the city? We would buy it." So buying, owning, selling, speculating with housing units, that's something that at this moment no city that is relatively growing or is in a good condition is safe of. Another way of inscription or another inscription on facades, which I rather actually refer to, is here letters in red, which of course now you recognize that in exhibition I also used red letters. If you now walk through Vienna, you can still see these writings, which are actually from the early 20th century, from the years 1920s, 1930s. I will translate this for you. It says, this house is built by the city of Vienna in the years 1925-26 by the means of the housing tax. Now we should know, or I would like to tell you, that this housing tax was an extremely progressive redistribution tax from those who had a lot of luxury. It was part of the package of luxury taxes, a taxing of, in very simple terms, of the rich to distribute to the poor, but not in terms of money, but in terms of real investment in infrastructure such as communal housing. So what we're seeing here is one corner of a facade of 64,000 housing units, of communal housing units that were built within Red Vienna from 1919 to 1933. It's the time of a social democratic government of the city. It became known with the name Red Vienna. You know very much, I'm sure, for instance, Karl Marxhof, which is one of the symbols of this housing building periods. And of course, there's many more of these communal housing blocks all around the city of Vienna. This is a plan from 1933, and it does show how social housing or workers' housing was spread throughout the city. And in fact, even historians claim that it was even very consciously, for instance, the Karl Marxhof placed right within the bourgeois district of Döbling. And until today, there isn't a single district in Vienna which doesn't have communal housing, Gemeindebauten, as we call it in German. And what is really crucial is that not only did the city then build 64,000 communal housing units, it was also housing the poorest, or those who had the least means, was extremely low. If I now would ask the audience, how much percentage of your income do you pay for housing? I'm sure that hardly anybody would actually be able to say 6 to 8%, only maybe if you own a house already, but just for renting. And Red Vienna also invested a lot into public amenities, libraries, public baths, public amenities, infrastructures, kindergarten, schools, etc. What is important and what I really like to stress out is that this doesn't happen out of anywhere. There was some quite crucial preconditions to this time. It was that Red Vienna actually had inherited quite strict rent control situation, which meant that the rent was already before the Red Vienna movement and housing development. Rent was limited, kept quite low. It was secured for renters to actually have it not limited as a contract, and that made an interesting development to happen, which by the pure fact that you couldn't make money by other people's housing needs, meaning by having people rent your homes, like your houses that you own, it actually stopped speculation and also building houses because you simply couldn't make much money of it. And that made land prices drop because also speculation that was high then just as much as it's high now on land prices also decreased, as it was also made no sense to speculate on land prices to go up, since again, with housing itself, you couldn't make much profit. And of course, the luxury taxing, all that together gave a situation that and that's now quite interesting, that made the private market not build anymore. There was also a housing crisis. So today you would maybe have governments who would say, okay, whoa, my God, the private market is not constructing anymore. We need incentives to make it happen. While you could also react, as Red Vienna did, to say, well, we don't stimulate the private market, but we use this momentum by this dropped the land of which the price was dropping anyway. They bought a lot of pieces of land, built up a land bank, and started to build housing units and housing blocks themselves, which then became the famous Red Vienna housing development, which is until today very much well known. So very different reaction of a government to the situation of the market and the crisis. This is a drawing, a sketch by Otto Neurath, who was then also very active in, he became, of course, famous for his diagrams, for his visualizations of achievements or of numbers. This here you can see how the growth, the number of built units grew year by year, nearly exponentially. As I already said, some historians claim that it was even as low as 4% of the income of workers to pay for rent within the housing units. This is quite incredible. This number has become nearly like a sort of visionary number within Vienna, as it's been discussed a lot. We just had 100 years of Red Vienna celebration, and even though it's maybe even too low, that has been critiqued. It needs some minimum, of course, for maintenance, operating costs, etc. But it does actually allow us to think that there was a time where it was actually realized a completely different notion of how you would definitely not be existentially dependent on making money in order to be able to house or to live. And to be so free, to not having to worry how you assure the high rent, of course, gives a lot of freedom and something to be aspired. There was already then a problematic allocation system. It was not enough housing units of this low price. So from the beginning, there was a question who would have access to communal housing, and that's a problem until today. And the notion, and already then, Austrian citizenship, domicile in Vienna, etc., marital status gave points, and that's the system until today, and one of very important critique moments of us housing activists, as until today, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who have no access to communal housing, also in Vienna, because of their papers or because of having not lived in Vienna long enough, or even their marital status, their family status. So coming back, however, to this, and you now see that I will be always in between celebrating what has been achieved, however, critiquing or critically inheriting what with achievements also still until today has to be done better, or even like only realized. So coming back to these red letters that you can see all around Vienna on these housing blocks of the 64,000 housing units that I just mentioned. So if you now visit Vienna, you will certainly see them. It made me and us, like a group of people, again and again do new collages to speculate into the future. What would be the red letters for future housing? And I'm going to translate this also. Now here we don't, we say maybe it's co-housing, maybe it's co-op housing, you name it. Maybe it is, we say here, it's made possible by the city of Vienna. So we're not necessarily writing anymore, it's built by the city of Vienna. It can also be supported. It's in the future years here, 24, 25. And then we want a democratic public discussion or debates about by what means. Because we need means to make sure that there is communal housing, but it could be heritage tax, it could be property tax, it could be climate taxes, CO2 taxes, etc. And also that could be an interesting democratic or even radical democratic debate on what's the notion of redistribution that would be needed. Well, that gets me to this, to the work that we will be doing in the next 2 months within the close to 2 months within this exhibition. You already saw that this is an incentive for a housing manifesto to be written, to be co-written, to be changed and worked on. And it has 4 parts, and these 4 parts say C.A.R.E all together. And it's more like a formal structure also around or like based on the words of caring, to give a structure and to raise the discussion amongst certain demands and claims. And I will get us through that now in these 4 chapters. Now, if we take the C, I started to say, okay, what if we would claim public property as public and housing as a public interest? It needs to go along with ceasing to sell public ground. And by the way, to sell social housing. It's about ceasing speculation, and it is about collectivizing, communalizing. We are looking, of course, for a word that would return or like really reverse the situation that we've seen for many years, the privatization of housing since Thatcher, the rights to buy, etc. But how can we come back? And of course, also in Brno, this is an interesting discussion to a notion of what the commons is. So let's take just the public interest for a moment. How could we, within housing, think public interest? If we start again with housing as a human rights, then I would like to show you 2 diagrams that may look dry at the moment, but I hope that I can make it understandable. If we think of communal or cooperative or whatever rent secured housing, then let's say there's an investment with capital expenditure into a house and 100%. And throughout the years, up to like 30, 35 years, this capital expenditure is actually paid off. So there's no more debt in the bank. If we think the rent more or less stably kind of secured, rent controlled, to maybe just grow a little, there is a gap which necessarily grows bigger and bigger. By the way, we are also thinking, of course, operating costs and all the costs a house still needs, and also the maintenance and also taking care of it and everything. But even with that, there's a bigger and bigger growing gap that within communal, cooperative, solidarity constellations becomes a solidarity contribution. Either the rent also goes down, which is also possible, which is happening in cooperative housing situations in Vienna, or even if it doesn't stay down, then we have a gap that can be used for new communal cooperative projects, or even for greenifying them, for ecologizing, etc., for anything that is for the common good. In the private market, we have the same situation. We have 100% of capital expenditure. Also, this house is being paid off with in the same speed, in the same amount of time. Now, in the worst case, rent is not even controlled. So rent goes up and this gap goes even bigger. And now, in this condition, is literally not coming back to communal or cooperative projects, but is what we could call private profit, is out of the reach of communal or collective decisions, democratic decisions. And this, of course, is unfortunately the general situation in many places. Unfortunately, even not in Vienna, but in Germany, for instance, or in a lot of places, it is even the situation that after a certain time, if it's funded housing gets out of this situation and becomes part of the private market. And exactly when the house is even paid off, this gap gets really big and is being privatized. Within a study that we just did for the Chamber of Labor in Vienna, we also looked into these different prices. This is communal housing in Vienna, cooperative, and this is private market, just the average. And now I'm speaking not about new contracts. New contracts would be skyrocketing beyond this page, much, much higher. We have like 20 euro, 22 euro per square meter new contracts in private housing, but you can already see just the average of long-term contracts. The private market is absolutely higher than what is like the coop. This is actually cooperative, and I should turn around the names, and this is communal in terms of housing renting prices. Now, to get this quickly into for a moment into a more international situation, with my students in London at the AA, we've looked into the housing crisis, of course, also there. And one very sad moment is the taking down of Robin Hood Gardens, a symbol of social housing of the 70s by the Smithsons. Everybody within the architecture field, of course, knows this project. It had been two parts. One has already been taken down. You see in the background already the sort of substitution, a sort of new development substituting this housing project, which has been internationally within the architectural world celebrated, which has been fought for and protested against evictions by a lot of people. There's still some home renters and owners living in this block, standing strong while waiting. I don't know the current situation of this last block, but it's been devastating and really incredible that it couldn't be done differently. The same students, we actually also did excursions in Vienna, and this is again Karl Marxhof. It's not only students, architecture students from London, but visitors from around the world that come and see an enormously long and large housing unit block. It's maybe not even it's not like architecturally the most celebrated, but it is of course quite something to have it named Karl Marx Hof, and it's become a symbol for also being critiqued, of course, by, for instance, Manfredo Tafuri for its idea of being a castle, even like a protective, too protectively looking as castle for homes. But it has become the symbol of a possibility of social housing never being sold. And that is, of course, the strength of Vienna. So if we think into the situation of Vienna today, then after the 64,000 units during the period of Red Vienna, and then this period was brutally stopped by Austro-fascism, and after the 1945, after the war, it slowly continued again and actually then grew again quite rapidly. So until today, there is not 64,000 anymore, but 220,000 council rental apartments, and then 200,000 subsidized rental apartments that are association or cooperative housing. In general, 75% of the Viennese are renting, and from these numbers, around 50% of the Viennese live in subsidized or communal housing for this secured rent. So you can see that just the fact that this is still within communal control and rent control, it really has kept the housing crisis in Vienna to maybe a lower problematic condition than in other places. Yet those who are independent, or who are, let's say, those who are dependent on the private markets, face exactly the same crisis as everywhere else. This funded housing has become very famous in terms of nearly iconic, these swimming pools on the roofs of Alt-Erla. which is one housing project from the 70s, one of the most also welcome by the people living in these blocks. There's very high uh, um, much love and admiration. Hardly anybody ever moves out here, and not only one swimming pool, but literally on all these blocks there is quite big swimming pools. It has nearly become an icon for that you could have social housing, and there's some sort of luxury through the mass of people living together, which you can hardly achieve within private developments, or okay, maybe only if you're a real heavily rich person. So I want to give it a moment of introduction of what's the systemic conditions in Vienna. That is very crucial. What you see here is a diagram of this is actually the Karl Marx Hof, the site of the Karl Marx Hof. And what we did here within our office, we sometimes visualize, we try to visualize the amount of land that the Housing and Urban Renewal Fund of Vienna, it's called in German Wohnfonds Wien, Wohnfonds Vienna, which is basically a public land banking institution, which actively buys land since kind of the start of Red Vienna until today, buys land and sells land or hands over land for social housing and public development. So for social housing or funded housing, it is public property development competitions that the city of Vienna organizes, and it has a lot of quality control possibilities because it owns land that it can give out for very cheap price, as also land is being speculated at very high price in Vienna as in other places. So what makes cities and communes and public institutions powerful is, of course, to have control and possibilities to over, and then there we are, this is the very basic condition for housing politics, it's land politics. So one of these competitions I would like to show you, it's one that my office did together with Teilbauarchitekten. We won a third prize, a developer competition. We happily joined it because within this, we joined with two limited profit developers, and it was meant to be 100% social housing, very not so often. Within our scheme, and this is just giving you an insight into it, we also were able to include a 25-meter long swimming pool on the roof. There is community spaces, children's playgrounds, this whole green space here in between the gardens are all part of the scheme. Roof terraces, this is a central community hall that can be used for different celebrations, workshops, kindergarten, etc. Just to show you that the spirit of that communal housing or social housing is actually not reduced to a minimum, but it can be looked and fought for to also include such amenities as the swimming pool on the roof. And we calculated that, and due to the number of housing units, it actually costs hardly anything for the single unit, and it gives such a pleasure, a lot of these amenities for social life within housing. In fact, in these developer competitions, what architects have to do is we team up with housing associations when it's about social housing, then like that is also limited then in rental price, and it's given this very low price land. Then you need to team up with limited profit housing associations, and in this scheme, we were able to actually realize 100% social housing, as I said, roof pool gardens, event hall, community centers, etc. And it's also, now just to give you an overview of what the amount of work is and also the level of definition that such a competition has, this or has to have. This also, of course, gives really the control to the city, in this case to Wohnfonds and the jury, and whoever wins has this proposal as a contract with the city to also realize everything that has been promised within the scheme. Now, we know from reality that everything that has been promised needs to be still discussed, or is often discussed, but it is a very good base for securing quality of social housing. Okay, looking forward, these are models that we built. I can just give you maybe a quick look into also 3D rendering that we did. And you see, we start with the swimming pool. You also see, of course, that at this moment in Vienna, this is one of the housing association's directors. We also spoke in this video, but you also see that, and this is, of course, mandatory, that all the roofs are green, that there's a lot of facade greening and an enormous ecological effort within these projects. And here you can see, and that's an interesting moment, we see that this competition was split in two parts because the central piece actually was already acquired by a private developer and couldn't be developed as a social housing competition. So within, okay, I'm just gonna, yeah. As for floor plans, we developed a series of very different floor plans, but we came, of course, across the one problem that everybody faces when it comes to social housing and to affordable housing. At the end of the day, even though the square meter price in renting is low within these social housing units, we still know that the affordability for families, for mothers and fathers with kids is so little that at the end one always ends up in reducing the size of the units. And then we even have a program in Vienna, it's called Smart Housing Program, that even limits the size. So what you can see here is, and it's let's say, it's fortunately not the 8 square meter room, which we have realized in the exhibition. That's what we as architects said we won't want to realize, but still we're very small, like we're 12, 13 square meters. We already developed corner loggias, which are not to be paid for by rent, which we, so to say, we tricked the law in order to increase the spatial quality, and we introduced a room for her own, and that is exactly one of the topics that we discuss in the exhibition. There is a big issue with smaller and smaller apartments and unaffordability, that oftentimes it's women, it's mothers who at the end do not take a room, make sure the kids have one, and then end up living in the living room. And it was a starting also development and quest and research moment for us to say, okay, how can we make sure that really everyone today has a room of her own? This moment is where we can look back into history, and today's quest and today's tests for minimum housing. How could you get ever and ever smaller? The 8 square meter room or the 8 square meter which still define a room. And if you just think of, and there's not even cardboards here, of a boy or a girl having to live in this room, maybe in a small apartment within the pandemic, maybe even being in self-isolation, we realize what that means for people. And so if we think of the easy way out to say affordable, we create something affordable because we make it simply smaller. This is, however, this is at the moment the program that also in Vienna is called Smart Housing. It reminds us of the Wohnung für das Existenzminimum, which was another program of CM2 in Frankfurt am Main in the 1920s. Architects around the world, or like in Europe, did a lot of putting their energy, their creativity into designing amazing small apartments, ever smaller, and in such creative ways that in the best sense you wouldn't even realize that it's yet smaller. However, and this is a beautiful critique by Giancarlo De Carlo in the time of the 60s, 70s, critiquing the modernist movement, these architects did not ask themselves why they would actually follow this quest to design ever and smaller. Who that was helping, who was suffering from it. So to ask what we are doing and not only how we are doing it, but asking why are we doing it, or why would we actually even join such tasks. Something really important to discuss, and how can we get out of the logic square meter and certain price, and that logically means smaller is more affordable. Coming back to this project, I already mentioned that the largest chunk of or piece of land could not be developed throughout such a competition. I'm not saying that we should have developed it. I found this already fairly big as a project, but it was developed by a private developer, somebody who had already secured the land. So it also split this development in two. And of course, it's more difficult to, and this certainly is not social housing, but this is then private market housing, most probably 200%. What's happening here? It's exactly what we could see and study within Vienna, but of course in many other places. In Vienna, it looks like this, that in 2000, the number of communal, and this should be read, the number of communal and cooperative housing units as opposed to private market housing units was clearly on the side of communal cooperative housing construction. And that changed rapidly and literally turned around in the last 20 years, so that now we see a much higher number of private market apartments being built, while a much smaller number of communal and cooperative housing units. And that, of course, we're claiming in the future it should kind of change back again if we want to construct it all. That's, of course, another ecological question that we need to face. But what happened there? I'm sorry. If we think of that, it not only is, of course, the private market investing heavily in urban space, but also it's heavy land speculation and investing into not only housing units to be used, but also really the global financialization market, global asset funds that are investing into housing units all around the world, and also in Vienna. So having said that, I want to change over to the A, the acquiring urban land as commons and the actively turning public housing into a democratic task, which if we just reduce that to, let's say, two words, acquire actively, then there is an issue in Vienna, as I can sense and feel and study in other places just as much. And we're just doing studies in Nuremberg, but of course also in London, it's the same condition. This is a large field area in Vienna that was owned by ÖBB, which is the Austrian rail company, which is logistically or logically or by definition still public, but acts as a private entity. And this is an installation we did saying basically all of that land would be 100% public land. And it's a play on words, 100% ÖBB. But what actually happened is that this land was sold off for high market prices. So you would have public land, however, being sold into the private markets with high speculation prices. And we get into a dilemma here, because even claiming that, of course, the rail company needs the money for having the trains run properly. So what we see often is that two public duties are played off against each other. What was the result in this condition is that it's a beautiful master plan by Fleiss-Trerowitz, and also with the idea of having a big, large park in the middle, that the housing development all around was, of course, even though it was 100% public land, it did not turn into 100% public housing, which could also be a logical number, but only 30% social, 30% higher price, and 30% completely free markets. So we have a situation where only 30%, and that's already higher than in many other places. So what Can Gülci and I did for an exhibition, we did an installation, and this is around this green field, exactly on this spot, on the roofs of the housing places, and we did ask for the fourth third. So for the fourth 30% of those who can certainly not afford private market housing, who cannot afford higher price than social housing, and who cannot even enter social housing due to restrictions because they don't have the right papers, they don't even have the minimum money that is required, etc. So there we are again. The quest that if housing is a human right, then how do we secure it most and for all for those who have no lobby, who are not even within those who are counted here in this regular urban planning measuring. If we look into, and that's an interesting subject, into the housing subsidies per year in Vienna, for instance, for such a social housing situation as I just showed, then this is just a little bit an older number, but it's quite high, as you can see. It's all object subsidies. That means it goes into new housing construction or into refurbishment, and only a few millions, and it's still a lot, but goes into subject subsidies supporting people directly. So there's a high number of millions of euros that would be there for social housing. But in fact, what happens is that there is not enough land that social housing can be constructed on. So there was years that Vienna couldn't even spend this million of euros in social housing because there was a lack of affordable land. And that made Vienna do a quite remarkable or invent a quite remarkable zoning category within the building law change of 2018. And this building zoning category is not called anymore housing, but it's called funded housing. So if the city of Vienna, the kind of official magistrates, introduce a change from a greenfield or a brownfield into housing, they could and should actually label it funded housing. And if it's labeled funded housing, that it should up to 75% of the land should be built, or 75% of the housing units must be funded housing. That means social housing. And because social housing can only be built on a limited land price, piece of land, and that's nearly 10% of the market price. So what this category does, it effectively limits land price. It brings down the land. And what happened at once was that landowners or those who speculated on land that was still just green fields claimed this was quasi expropriation of their expected gain, of their expected profit. So what I want to say with that is, it sounds a little bit dry, but it's quite a remarkable way of really getting involved with private property. Of course, I mean, these land pieces are at this moment not worth so much, so everybody would still gain quite some value with being then turned into the land being turned into funded housing, but it makes an enormous difference to the category housing at this moment. And coming to this acquire actively in another sense of, again, also working against speculation, I want to point out a syndicate structure in Germany. It's called Mietshäuser Syndicat, and in Austria there's a number of teams of groups actually building up Habitat Austria, and they are actively collectivizing land and houses, actively buying it off the private market and putting it into a syndicate structure where, I'm sorry that this is German, but the syndicate structure and this housing association co-own the house, and by co-owning that, make sure that it will never be speculated with it again. And also these houses, again, work on the same logic that if there is some extra profit, then it will be put into a solidarity fund which supports new projects. I will show you, this is some members of the team. The group is called Schlor, Schöner Leben ohne Rendite. Live nicer without Rendite, without also without evictions. They're playing with this word. The name in the beginning was called Live Better Without Raiffeisen, Schöner Leben ohne Raiffeisen, which is a bank. And what happened is that they were really successful in buying this property with these structures that is already existing there, a nice hall that is used as a community sports center and some garages and workshops, etc., in an more industrial district of Vienna. This is already a drawing that we did in our office. We are the architects of this project. We analyzed well what part of this area of this piece of land and construction should be kept. Where do we continue to build on top? This is going to be a new part of the development, the existing hall that we refurbish and so develop together with this group a most autonomous working and living situation. The group itself managed to collect the investment budget directly only from, we could say it friends, but literally from people who are giving credit, direct credit to the group, and all well organized. They did a lot of advertising and managed literally to get all the money that they needed without needing a single bank. We are developing the architecture at this moment, really working out to have straw clay construction, also being possibly finally legalized, or like within all the different technical conditions. We're in a construction site of one part already being built. Here, the whole, you don't see it on the left. We're just about to, we've just torn down some workshops which we could really not maintain because they were very poor quality. Where the housing project comes in, logically we are, and every construction site, construction company at the moment is very carefully taking apart the materials and recycling it. And this is actually quite nice because the old construction you could also quite easily and simply deconstruct it into materials, as it's still very simple construction. So this project is just in the making. We are at this moment developing that. And to wrap this project up, it's all about using and not owning. It's outside of the free market economy. Nobody who is part of this group needs some starting money themselves. It's similar, as I said, to the Mietshäuser-Syndikat itself is called Habitat. It's also similar to a community land trust. And however, we could also compare it to institutional housing, like co-op housing. It is at the end something similar to co-op housing, and it is based on solidarity economy because, again, when the capital expenditure goes down after having rebuilt the structure, there is going to be a solidarity contribution for further projects, for, again, getting more and more land and buildings out of the private markets, of the speculation market. And now we're coming to the R, race, communal and cooperative housing, rent control. I'm not speaking about rent control anymore because I've already said it with Red Vienna, how important rent control is to make sure that you cannot make money with the housing needs of others. But if we look into the word raising, like how to have more self-organized, more self-initiated housing units, then I would like to show you another project that we did in 2016. We call it the Intersectional City House, and it's for an association in Vienna, which is a group of people that all of them actually come with different intersectional experiences. Some of them are handicapped in the wheelchairs. A lot of them are from the LGBTQ plus supporting institution that supports migrants who have to leave their countries because of their sexual orientation. They are themselves very all organized in different NGOs and support groups, are themselves politically quite active. Hardly any of them have money, so there was a lot of self-built. And what did they do? They managed to rent a house all together in one piece. And we developed what we called an intersectionality. Not only the group is intersectionally composed, but also the house works in section. So there's not a single private unit, but only private spaces. We made the entire house as barrier poor or free as possible. So accessible, built in a lift, made sure that the person in the wheelchairs come into every single corner. We introduced a large community collective kitchen in the ground floor, and as I said, single and collective spaces throughout the space. This is the moment that I watched them. It took, I would say, half an hour for them to organize. This is after the meeting, already some people left, within this flip chart, their solidarity economy model, which says that everybody here pays only as much or little as she can. So independent if you need more space because of your support by the wheelchair and or if you have kids or whatever, it is about securing each other. You give what you can, and the group makes sure that those who have more actually give more in order to secure the rent and debt for the construction site. And as I already said, the accessibility concept is that the group doesn't understand accessibility just physically, but also economically, also socially. There shouldn't be barriers to the way of housing as you want it to be. If independent, you should not have any kind of limitations relating to your skin, to your sexual orientation, to your material possibilities, etc. Yeah, and it's a very beautiful house itself with lots of nice details. This beautiful making of tiles. They collected all free tiles, and then there's somebody in the house is a real tile artist. Made beautiful moments of detailing. In fact, this house relates back to. That's my interpretation now. It's not the group being consciously doing that, but to the Vienna settlement movement, a self-help, self-built structure. We made very clear as architects what do the companies need to build for security, but what can be built by the group itself. And the house concept actually relates back to an early women's movement house, which is a one kitchen house, sharing facilities such as the kitchen, and by that freeing up for more time and more space and other conditions in the other parts of the space. So if we look into this project, it is about the right to housing, reuse, self-built. It's ecological in terms of using the gray energy of built structures, supporting the neighborhood. It's active solidarity economy. I would say, I've hardly ever seen such a utopian model of a society as how this group lives together. It's actively critiquing racism, ableism, discriminations of any senses. And as I just mentioned, the sharing economy, it's co-housing within this one kitchen house with everything that comes along also as issues or problems. But they're working actively and beautifully on their community. And that brings us to the end. And the end is an E, as in end, or to a word that has become recently used a lot again. We could even in German nearly say fashionable. It's not fashionable. It's definitely not the right word for it. But it's about expropriation. The E goes along with my claim for, let's say, expropriate the expropriators, a disputed demand, which we should inherit as a regulative idea in democratic struggles over land or over housing. And I'm aware of the fact that expropriation as a term, it depends on the translation, could be fairly misunderstood. And already in German, it should not be mistaken, for instance, with what the National Socialists, Nazis did when they stole Jewish houses, for instance. But expropriation is in Austria and Germany, in the different legal conditions, is actually a law that allows for forced selling or collectivizing, socializing of goods that are needed to make sure that the public duty, for instance, for housing or the public duty for mobility is being granted. So not only in the German context, but also in the Spanish context, it is at this moment with Ada Colau, the very much celebrated mayor in Barcelona. Here's the moment when she starts to use a law that has been there for a long time, but is only now being activated in order to expropriate housing units that have been taken back by the banks, a lot of them during the financial crisis 2007-8, and just have been sitting there empty while the city faces an enormous housing crisis. And now by using this law, by activating it, it is possible to temporarily expropriate these houses, demand them and give them to people in need for housing, and stopping this having housing units stand still. I think this is a very brave move. And if we think of, for instance, Barcelona now also being in the news for their Barcelona blocks, we could also call this a beautiful way of, let's say, expropriating in a way the cars from their rights to just go anywhere in the city, but giving such a beautiful quality back to the inhabitants by freeing up space in between the blocks for car-free areas. But coming back to the very core of expropriation, the most, I would say, remarkable moment recently was the momentum when the referendum for the Deutsche Wohnen und Co. Enteignen actually successfully passed over, I think, like 59% of voters in Berlin. If you think of that, it was in September this year, and it was a referendum for the socialization of Berlin's large real estate companies, and one of them being, for instance, Deutsche Wohnen and Co. And it is a company that privatized Berlin communal housing stock. This company was recently bought by Vonovia. Vonovia has bought Buwog. Buwog, again, is the outcome of a privatization, Austrian state public housing stock, a fairly big one. So you can really see we're talking about hundreds of thousands of housing units within large real estate companies, and acting accordingly. So this is my ending slide. It's a little comment and note and greeting note that I made for Berlin during the referendum. I will translate it again. It says expropriated and greenified, ecologized by the city of Berlin. And then it says by the means of, and again, we're talking about, is it about rich tax, heritage tax? We could discuss what sort of redistribution of literally, and in this sense, referring back to Red Vienna. This is why there is a tax on the wall, but we could think, of course, of many different tasks and means. I'm looking forward to long and intensive and hopefully fruitful discussions throughout all the exhibition that will happen, and now maybe a short one also relating to my inputs that I just gave. And I'm happy to de-share and end my screen. Thank you.
Okay, Gabu. Thank you very much for the great lecture, and I think it's a great start for the whole exhibition and for the lectures that are coming. So first of all, I would like to invite, of course, all of you guests and people who joined us online to invite you for the discussion and to encourage you to pose questions. So, but before you maybe think of what you would like to ask, I'll start with the first question. I'm glad that you showed not only the Red Vienna housing, but you also shown the settlement movement, which sometimes are somehow thought as two different models, and sometimes are even given, into the contrast. for example, the example of Karl Marxhof as a in a way municipal housing produced by a system, like in a way in a large scale and in a very systematic fashion. And then there is this settlement movement, which was somehow out of the system provision of the housing, in a way self-help, self-build housing that was after the fact legalized. So basically it was the land was grabbed just in the middle of the crisis, and then maybe later after the fact it was thought through and legalized later. So what we should take out from these two models, maybe even in general, what we should take from this modernist like struggles for the housing, because of course housing, provision of the housing, you showed also the existence minimum idea. So it was one of the main tasks of the modernist movement in the first half of the 20th century. And maybe it's nice to see these two models that happened in Vienna almost simultaneously. So what we should take out of them for today's crisis?
I mean, this is really what I'm also exploring in this book that you mentioned so nicely in the beginning of the introduction of the exhibition, because we could, of course, look into the settlement movement as the more radical democratic movement of this time then. And it has been, of course, often brought into discussion when it comes to self-initiated housing projects, to Baugruppen projects, to people taking initiative and organizing the way of housing and living today again. And also some of the projects that I showed are clearly within this notion, and they are reacting to a system that at this moment, even though it's working well, it's taking care of, it's working well for some. I hope I made it clear that also the housing situation in Vienna is not supporting everyone with decent housing, but it does not fulfill a couple of things, which is until today, even the idea of top-down housing provision is very standardized and very what I call even like it's an inherited paternalistic way of knowing how people want to live. So this the projects that we saw from today that I showed are clearly groups that say we want to live differently, and actually we don't find that in an affordable way and I don't want to even call it markets, because I think we should stop to call the housing landscape a market. But I would also, and this is why the duality is interesting, I would also not celebrate or fetishize that everybody would now take care of his or her housing herself, because there's a lot of people who would just be happy to be provided with proper housing, or with hopefully a good possibility to choose a way of living with a certain house and quality and affordability. And so this is why I do consciously try to mix and really always bring both situations as a need, but both situations need development, need critique, need constant evaluation, and of course, I mean, when it comes to the responsibility of politics, the responsibility of planning, we see a real crisis at the moment in so many places. And when it comes to the self-help, self-development, we see also a crisis, because I know, for instance, just from the experience in Vienna, I know so many more groups who would actually want to be active, but find no conditions at all, like no affordable piece of house or rental place that they could refurbish or change, so the conditions aren't there. Because at this moment, there's such an active run and buying off the market. It's incredible. So even for the self-help condition, I think it's tricky. But with this intersectional city house, what I found interesting, we could call it, of course, a new generation of settlements that is not anymore at the edge of the city, not anymore on the green land, but it is looking into non-used space within the city itself. It's refurbishing, it's rebuilding, it's doing what to bring the social and ecological crisis together, what we should do to make sure that empty space is being used, and the city that is to a large extent already been built, that it is actually continued to be rebuilt rather than squatting new land on the outskirts, which was part of the settlement movement in the early 20th century. But I think so too. I think it's very important to have both and to actually look into what I also did in my book is look into the way it was incorporated into the top-down structure, and by that also stopped. So there was a promise of the settlement development that could have been and could actually be reactivated, and that's also what I'm trying to work on.
Perfect. Thank you for your answer. Maybe let's try to give space also to the audience. So is there a question? Shall I continue? Please. You can raise your hand, I mean physically like this, if you turn your camera on, or you can raise the hand in the Teams. You can join us. Any questions? Okay, so let's see. Hopefully, try to formulate your questions and then let me know anytime. Maybe let's continue with these two models, because of course maybe the Baugruppe model, or let's say that the model that could be connected to the settlement in terms at least of the architectural task, because let's say the Baugruppe model is in a way also a model maybe less standardized as you have shown, because you can choose where to direct your finances, or where to direct the things that you are able to spend and for what. But is there still place for more like standardized housing? Because this is mainly the issue of my country where I live, because of course after the 1948, where the communists took power, they tried to solve the ever-present housing crisis, which was already there in 20s and so on. So they try to solve it through this, let's say maybe for this means of production, that means to standardize housing and produce as much as possible through standardization. So this was this kind of technocratic approach, and in a way it works, even though it is of course very much criticized precisely for its standardized manner. But so-called paneláky or panel housing actually is still there, and nearly 30% of the population is living in these panel houses, and sometimes they are not even like feeling discontent. They are okay in living in there. So do you think, is there still a space for really like maybe not a state run development, but maybe like city run development, that really a city becomes a developer by itself, or is this outdated model?
If we look into Vienna, it's not outdated at all. This is exactly why so many places look into Vienna, and now the fact is that when I'm outside of Vienna, I sometimes sound like as if I'm a marketing person or salesperson for the Vienna model, and when I'm inside Vienna, I'm a harsh critic of what doesn't go right. But when it comes to the idea that, as I showed, that until some time ago, more housing was built and constructed that was at least like not, if not communal, then on the funded housing model, which is still within a collective and with law protected conditions. It's limited profit associations that are developing them. It's commune that can also allocate housing units then and similar to with their own communal housing. So there is quite still a lot of development of social housing in Vienna. So it proves that the model is not dead. However, that some of the that some concepts of housing cannot be found there, and for instance, the Baugruppen development is a reaction to that. That within mass housing or anonymous housing, the problem that is so difficult to solve is how can you still have ways of engaging with how your housing unit or how your housing development or how even the garden kind of is being developed. How can you exercise your right to the city as a right to engage and also build it yourself? And then again, of course, the beauty of mass housing is that you don't have to do that. So there's, however, there's still a search of a lot of us to see what could be the level of freedom that is embedded in the provision of mass housing and the openness and the different models that allow for certain qualities that some lucky people or people who can afford it can actually find with Baugruppen. Because at the end, we know that some of these projects that's interesting. Maybe the two that are shown is a bit specific because they are so clearly at least trying to working on the fact that you at least don't need money to be part of such a group yourself. But of course, everybody of these groups needs time and effort, and the members need to be willing to really work and invest in the building up of the community, which not everybody has neither. So coming back to the model in Brno in the Czech Republic, or generally where social housing has maybe completely other notion, stigma, maybe also within the historic context, of course, I believe that there needs work on the housing units that are existing themselves. And there has been quite some beautiful projects where mass standardized housing has been changed, been heterogenized, so to say, gotten out of its homogeneous condition of or standardization. But then also, I do hope that there will be a new appreciation if it came along with for communal housing or for collective social housing, in terms of that at the end of the day, it is really building up a collective infrastructure that in the best case would take care of you and me and everybody who wants it. That doesn't mean that we need 100% of it. That maybe would not be good for any place to have only 100% of anything. But at least what we can see honestly in Vienna is that also some of the Gemeindebauten didn't have a good image, but they were refurbished, renovated. And I've only recently met more and more students again and people who are actually proud or who want to live in a Gemeindebau. So I do think that that things are changing here. But this is exactly why I'm so happy to be invited to Brno to again learn how the condition and the situation is so very different depending on what system the mass housing was developed in, how the notion of state-delivered space relates to doing it yourself, owning it, ownership versus the luxury of renting. Is so different if we look into the Eastern European countries, and of course also the way I work with regards to the conditions in London or in other places where, again, ownership had been much more powerfully embedded as the logical thing to achieve in life than which luckily in Vienna, the renting system until now, it's also changing. Yeah, a lot of people are worried and they feel like they have to put their money into a home because as the more, for instance, pension funds or pension security is being destabilized, the more it turns people into ownership of housing. And of course, also the bank situation, that money on the bank isn't worth anything, but you know that your if you put it into concrete gold, it will necessarily or logically raise in terms of value. So, however, I found this so beautiful when the Chamber of Labor in Austria worked out how if you have a large scale rental system, a lot of people renting, and mostly from communal or collective non-profit conditions, you have the best pension security. Because at the end, these housing units are infrastructure, public infrastructure. They logically don't need, they get down in just to maintenance costs, the diagrams that I showed. And so the older population gets, and the houses also get older, logically, actually the rents should be super secured. And you could again and again renew and build more houses. But of course, a lot of the system is trying to break exactly this logic and turn it around and make us believe that we are more secure if we own. Yet, the beauty for those who still rent in a secured situation, they know in Vienna that it gives you more freedom if you rent. Only you have to trust the rental system. You have to trust that it will not change too easily in the future.
Yeah, that's actually interesting because the like overwhelming logic here is to really, if you have money to buy your own home, at least in a big cities. Maybe could we maybe a little bit elaborate? You mentioned limited profit developers, because this is the model that is now like the core model for the Vienna, and I think it historically a little bit changed because at the time of Red Vienna it was really like produced by the government and so on. The government employed the architects to plan the housing and so on. So really there was no difference between city and the developer. The city itself was the developer. And now in Vienna, you have these limited profit developers, which basically means that their profits are or have to be invested back to the social housing. And maybe I would like to somehow link it also to the graphs you have shown that the percentage of social housing to the private market housing is changing. So where is the problem? If there is this system of limited profit developers that somehow have to follow certain rules also about the housing itself, or how it should it look like and so on. So why is the private part rising up?
Because I mean, literally, you need the limited profit housing development is only possible on limited price land. So one very first basic condition is that also in Vienna, there is to some extent, there has been a land grabbing run. Yeah? So a lot of speculative buying of land, knowing that the city is growing. Especially there was 10 years of constant speech of the city is growing so rapidly. I mean, that really opened up all sorts of development possibilities. The city saw itself not capable of building just with limited profit, and communal actually they stopped in 2004, which was also a big crisis, that you would stop a system that you have developed and a structure that is relatively well working. And since a couple of years, the city of Vienna has declared that it wants to build communal housing itself again, but you destroyed something. To build that up again is quite an enormous task, and they haven't been very well managing. So this we have a really weird situation that we have limited profits corporations and developers that want to build limited profit housing but cannot because it's not enough. And these competitions are becoming rare, and the land is rare, so even more competition around these few pieces of land. So, or you have to find a piece of land yourself, or you find it from the city. Then we have an ecological crisis, and there's a lot of protests against ever more building on new land. So some of the construction is also stopped. And one of it, for instance, some of it is being stopped currently with a protest against a highway that supposedly is needed to access this social housing developments, all rather on the edge of the city. And what we critique heavily, a lot of central pieces of land, the city cannot even with the ÖBB, with the railroads that is public, but it's the state, the city has no access to these pieces of land. So if the rail company decides to sell it off to the private market, it's gone. And then it can only via the zoning processes and so on, the city can start to get some percentage back to become social housing. So there's a lot of different issues. I mean, we have Buwok, for instance, and now Vonovia come to Vienna after they have literally, so to say, become the privatized section of our state-owned housing units, a big crisis, a big scandal. And now they come and they're actually applying for building social housing in Vienna because they also want access to private land. And I really am very angry at the city of Vienna that it allows private developers such as even like as the Buwok to also be on the social housing market, because they even have different conditions. So they, because they're private developers and not limited profit developers, they are not within the limited profit regulation laws. So they have some regulations that they have to support the housing units for a limited price for some time, but then these units again becomes part of the private market. It's a very German model. And all of that has been introduced, I would say, because there was a supposed pressure that the city cannot handle the growth and that so much housing is needed. Now they realize the numbers, also numbers are very powerful. And the growth rhetorics is very powerful. So the fearing of not handling growth opened a lot of possibilities for the private market also in Vienna.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the explanation. Maybe let's again try the audience in the meantime. So, any questions? What about Carolina? I think Carolina might have something to say or not.
Hi. I don't have a question. I have just many things in my head. And if you force me to say something, I would like to mention that I noticed that one of the Czech, it's not, I'm not sure if it's officially cooperative, but the Czech group of people just signed a buying contract for a first, let's say, solidarity house. I think it's the first one, or as far as I know. And they said that it took them 8 years to get to find a like affordable land or house to be refurbished and to get all the money. And I find it interesting that it's so complicated that like there is a system which basically limit or block these kind of activities, or that and that even all the burden of the workload and so on is on the group of like normal people who just wanna get housing. And I think I mean what's also interesting that for example Prague started to manage its land for development. it created a Prague Prague development company, which is like owning or has in charge this land, and they will start to offer some of the land to cooperatives, to kind of Baugruppen. But I think they focus mainly on the middle class, because first, the land still won't be that cheap. Second, even the construction and all around it won't be that cheap. So it will be like the affordable way for the middle class to get access to its own housing. But what I find even like also interesting, that these cooperatives, I don't think that they have the solidarity idea incorporated in their working. So that's basically just a group of people creating its own housing, but there is no like aim to make it bigger, obtain more land, make the solidarity fund. I know that of course it happens also in Vienna, but I know, or I had the feeling that there are more and more people interested in the solidarity way of cooperative housing, that they, I don't know, make a fund so that they secure rent for people who might have some dropouts in income, or some refugees or former homeless people who are then allowed to live in. So I was just happy to hear that there was a group, or there is a group who just managed to get a contract for non-decommodified housing, let's say.
I think it can, again, if you relate to Baugruppenprojekte in Vienna, which have received land and are also middle class. A lot of, I think the two projects that I showed are not these typical Baugruppenprojekte. They're very much on the margins, and they're actually, both of them are working without funds, with public funds. They're completely independent, really much like settlement self-organization, but there's a lot of Baugruppen that work with fund money and also funded land. And then it is quite similar to the developers competition, that these Baugruppen also have to compete for a piece of land. That's what Prague could also do, by the way. It's a bit critical because it makes the life even harder for this Gruppen. But what it does is, and maybe it can be done without a competitive condition, but because the land is actually, it's really a gift from the public. These Baugruppen receive land that is down to 20% of the market price for the land, for the house. So this is the moment that the city, with its land fund, actually demands the quality, and it has 4 pillars of quality control, and one of them is called social sustainability. And this is where they ask for concepts, how this group is not only kind of self-isolated white middle class happy bubble, but the demand of this group, because they're given this very cheap land by all our tax money, it's like kind of a collective, they need to give something back to the public. So this is when it comes to have non-profit community spaces that they run. They open up for, as you said, like some housing units for people in need, etc., etc. But that is, again, if I may say so, not only because they are so good humans, but because, again, it is embedded in the structure of how you get access to this quite, I would say, it is quite a special treat by the public, to be then able to have this very cheap and low price land to build on, depending now on if some of them own their house themselves as a group, or they rent also, or they anyway team up with limited profit developments, but have the quality and the luxury of developing exactly the houses they wanted.
Yeah, I'm glad you're mentioning this. I'm not sure if it was also said in the presentation, but I know about this tool of the city of Vienna. I don't know much about the program which the city of Prague is planning for their lands, which are supposed to be offered to the cooperatives. But like it seemed that it's not so well thought through. But I didn't hear that they are planning also these kind of columns or demands. Of course, there will be some. There will be competition because there are only few of the plots, and I guess there will be higher, like more groups will apply for it. But I'm not sure if they set the conditions, including the social sustainability and the others.
But then again, maybe this is also a possibility to what we're just doing now, to really share. And I mean, it's also all the cities are at this moment testing, learning, finding out. I mean, we need to bring together policymakers, and that's happening a lot, of course, to really also learn from experiences. This social sustainability pillar hasn't been there for a long time. It has only there was before, like now it's been there for quite some years, but it has also been introduced in the moment when they realized we need something like that. Yeah?
Okay, so maybe we are already approaching the end of the second hour of our program today. So maybe this was a good closing remark that we should somehow join and discuss our ideas and what ought to be done, which will happen actually. So once again, all of you who you are present, I would like to invite you for the lectures that are coming, that are again organized by Gabu Heindl. So she will invite her collaborators from different parts of the world, and you can come either to gallery or to join us online next time, which will be maybe Karolina can help me, but it will be on 18th of January. Is it right?
Yes, we will confirm the dates.
Okay, we will confirm the dates, but the plan is the 18th of January. There will be a contribution again from Vienna, and this is the already mentioned habitat. Then 25th of January, there will be a moderated talk by Gabu herself with her colleagues from Nuremberg. 1st of February, there will be architects for social housing from London. And 8th of February, there will be colleagues of Gabu again from Vancouver, and it will be Marika Albert. And the finissage and the presentation of the manifesto that will be created online here in the gallery will happen on the 17th of February. So you are all invited for the lectures and then for the finissage. At the end, I still have to thank to all the people that make this possible and that collaborated with me and with Gabu in making the exhibition happen. And so I have to thank, first of all, of course, to Karolina, who organized it. Then I have to thank to our alumni, which is Karolina Munkova, Ludmila Jankovichova, then Adam Tomášek, then Šimon Doubrava, Adela Vepšková, and of course I had to forget someone, then Adela Šoborová, who is facing me here, who helped to build the exhibition. So mainly, of course, Gabu came up with the idea, but the alumni from the faculty helped to build it and organize it. So I have to thank them all. And of course, I have to thank again Gabu for even trusting us to make it happen and to join us tonight for the opening. So thank you, Gabu, again. And thank all of you for joining us online.
Thank you both and everyone who was such a great team. It's been a pleasure. Even within these difficult times, it's great to be there, and I'm looking forward much.
Perfect. So thank you all, and goodbye.